Okay, today we are doing sourdough. This is my sourdough mother or sourdough starter, and this is important because it's what raises your bread. It's the wild yeast that raise your bread. So you need to be bubbly and active before you start to use it in your bread. So about 7 o'clock in the morning, I feed my sourdough mother. So I do 1:1 ratio. So 100 grams of starter, 100 grams of flour, and 100 mils of room temperature water. So if I'm baking a lot, I will have my sourdough starter out on the bench and I'll be feeding it once a day. If I'm not baking much, I will put my sourdough starter in the fridge and I'll only need to feed it once a week. When I go to feed it, I'm just getting 100 grams out of the jar that it's in. The rest we call discard, and we use it for something else or we throw it away. But what you need is a really strong old mother, so one that has developed. What I recommend is going to your favorite bakery, your favorite sourdough bakery, and asking if you can buy a small amount of their starter just to get excited, just to start raising your first loaves of bread. Or maybe you know somebody that bakes sourdough and you could ask for a little bit of theirs. So once I feed the sourdough mother, I'm going to leave it out on the bench to get nice and bubbly and active. Okay, so this recipe will give you one good sized loaf of bread, around 1 kilo, which I normally get 12 sort of slices out of. Okay, so this is the recipe for the bread. I've got 100 grams of sourdough starter. You need it to be really bubbly. I like to add it in when it's really bubbly and active so that it can feed on the flours you're about to add. At this stage, to know that your mother is ready, when you add the water, your mother should float, or your sourdough starter should float. That's when you know it's nice and bubbly and ready to raise your bread. Don't worry about lumps, just give it a really good mix. Then you want 500 grams of high protein bread flour. I'm currently using a 00 bread flour, which is normally used in pizza making because I like how crispy it makes the crust. And I am playing around a lot with my crusts, using steam, using different temperatures, because I don't want a really firm crust, the type that when you toast it, you hurt your gums. I just want a nice light crispy crust. This recipe is sort of a combined recipe that I've gathered from a few different people, not only how much I put in it, like the quantities, but also the method. So I've just worked on it and I've made a recipe that works for me and my time schedule. I did a recipe at one point that was a lift and fold, which is quite common in sourdough. You're lifting the bread and folding it, and it was so you would do 4 lift and folds every half an hour for 4 hours, and it was I just couldn't do it. It was just not realistic for me to be able to do that. I would need to sort of take the bread with me where I was going, picking up kids, dropping off kids, etc. So this recipe I found is just easy. It makes a really great sourdough loaf, and I don't have to worry about taking care of the bread like it's a baby. So as you're kneading this, it's going to be sort of a bit lumpy, a little bit maybe dry, but also a little bit wet, and that's completely normal. It's just because the bread hasn't hydrated yet, so the flour and the water is still a bit separated. And so when you knead it for 5 minutes and then you're going to rest it for 1.5 hours to 2 hours without touching it, you're going to leave it in the bowl to rest. In that time, the flour and the water, connect together. And so after that 1.5 hours to 2 hours, the dough will be completely different because it will have hydrated. So don't worry too much right now. Just give it a really good knead. I'm being quite gentle when I'm kneading right now because I don't want to bump the table, which will bump the camera. So normally I'm kneading quite a lot firmer and I'm moving it around a lot more. But right now I'm being quite gentle. So normally I would get my sourdough mother out around 7 o'clock in the morning and give it a good feed. Then I would leave it on the bench or place it in some warm water to start getting really bubbly and active. And then I would normally start my bread around 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Somewhere there I would start my bread dough. And so I would knead for 5 minutes. I would leave it for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and then I would come back and knead it for another 5 minutes, and then I would leave it for 4 hours, and then I would give it a light knead and a shape. I'm going to show you all this, but I just want to sort of let you know what time that you need to sort of start to get a bread that is well fermented. You sort of need to be there from lunchtime onwards. You need to be home or somewhere you can knead the bread from lunchtime onwards. So although it's not really a technical bread, I wouldn't say it's a technical bread, but you need to be in one place for that amount of time to be able to knead and to make sure it's in a nice warm spot and look after it. Once you've done that last portion and form of your loaf, you're actually going to put it in the fridge overnight or leave it on the bench overnight depending on the outside temperature. So you won't actually bake your bread till the next day, and you can leave it for 12 to 24 hours, and I've even left it for 48 hours and still had a really great raise in my bread. Alright, so we're going to put a damp cloth on it or maybe some cling wrap and give it a rest for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Then you're going to take it out and you can see right here it's sticky. It looks completely different. It's no longer lumpy, it's glossy, and you'll see here in a minute when I go to knead it that you don't want too much flour. You just want to keep it nice and sticky.
And this is the point where you should add your salt. So sprinkle your salt in before you knead, and then once it's kneaded it should be well incorporated in. Just because yeast doesn't really enjoy a lot of salt, it likes sugar, so it feeds on sugar. So if you do add the salt in the front of the recipe, it may slow down your yeast's growth.
Alright, then you're going to cover it up in your wet towel again or your cling wrap or plastic bag and just give it that rest for the 4 hours. And then your final light knead and form is quite gentle. You don't want to knock all the air bubbles out at this stage. So I'm just going to cut it into my portions so I can make 2 loaves of bread. I'm making 2 smaller loaves of bread. And so you'll see right now I'm just going to push it out slightly, and then I'm going to tuck the edges in. The outer edges, I'm going to tuck them in. Use your scraper here if you need to, if it gets a little bit too sticky, but yeah, try not to use too much flour. Alright, and then I'm going to sort of tuck it back on itself, really tighten it up. So you can see me sort of tucking and pulling at the same time. I really just want to tighten that surface of the bread up. That's going to hold in all those nice air bubbles. I'm sort of forming it into a log there with my hands because that's the shape of my baskets. When I flip it, you can see there's no real seam. There's no line where the bread might unravel, or when it bakes, it's going to leave a big line in it. My hand gets a bit stuck there. But you want it to be nice and smooth. If it's not, you want to sort of knead it again so that the bottom is all connected. You need it to be nice and strong because when it goes to bake, you don't want there to be any weak spots where the bread will want to rise from, because that will distort the look of your bread. You want it to rise out the top, not out the bottom. So it's really important there's no seal on the bottom there. It's got to be nice and connected. That's why you want it to be sticky. Folding over my edges, and then I'm rolling it and pulling it back on itself just to really tighten the surface of the loaf. Forming it up with my hands, and then I'm popping it into the basket. No seam on the bottom. You want to flour your basket quite heavily, or your bowl or whatever you have to hold the form of your loaf overnight. You want to flour it really well, because if it sticks when you try to turn it out, it may deflate your loaf and you'll end up with a really flat loaf. So it's really important that it doesn't get stuck in whatever you're putting it in to do this last proofing. These baskets my mum actually gave me, and they've got this really good linen fabric on them, and that just stops the loaf from sticking, so you don't need much flour at all. This is my previous basket. You can see it's caked full of flour because it doesn't have that linen cloth on it, so I would normally just cake it full of flour, but I've found those linen cloths to work really well for it not to stick. But in a pinch, just you can use a bowl, you can flour a bowl. So when I was first starting out, I just would flour a bowl and put my dough in the bowl, in the fridge, covered up, and that would hold perfectly fine. If you find you really like making sourdough, you can always come back and buy the baskets. They do produce a better shape, and a shape that's easier to cut, but you can get them in all different shapes and sizes as well. Something else you could do is just get a small portion of cloth and use it to help you out a little bit. So put it in your bowl or put it in your basket, dust it, and then you can put your loaf into that without it sticking. The cloths really do help too, because they move, and you can sort of peel them out of the basket a bit easier than you can if it sticks. It's not great if it sticks. You have to throw it out because it doesn't rise very well. So that's just what I found. So then you want to cover your loaves up. For the final stage, I put cloth, and then I put a plastic bag. You just don't want a skin to form, so if you're putting them away overnight or leaving them out overnight, depending on the temperature outside, you want to make sure they don't get a skin.
So the moisture will stay in that plastic bag, and you can see here they're quite crinkly. I reuse them. Don't really like to use plastic where I can, but I'm happy if it's going to improve my sourdough loaf and I can also reuse them. I'm quite happy to do that. Okay, so it's the next morning and I've got my loaves out. I like to leave them out for about 20 minutes on the bench just to come up in temperature a little bit before I put them into the oven. You also want to make sure that you preheat your oven, okay, so get that on nice and early so your oven can come up to temperature. I like to put mine at 200 to 250, and that just really depends on the crust that you want. So 200 for me creates a lighter crust, 250 is more of a firm crust. So just depending on what I'm doing is what temperature I put it at, but usually it's sitting at about 200 degrees. This in my hand here is a razor blade. It's just a feather razor blade. You can get a lot of fancy things that you can use to put lines on your bread, but I'm not at the stage yet where I am able to buy fancy things to make sourdough. I'd love to in the future, or maybe I'll get them for Christmas or something like that, but I'm even just still getting excited. And so a lot of the baskets I've been given or I've purchased cheaply, but I've just got a really simple razor blade, quite thin razor blade, and you can see here I'm sprinkling the tops with a light layer of flour, and I'm just smoothing that out. This is just for the look, and so when I do my scores for the pattern, I'm being so light you'll almost not even see them, and so it's just really making a pattern in the flour and just a little bit into the crust. If you were to cut deeply right now, that's when your bread would deflate. So all the designs and the patterns that you're doing will just be super, super light. Okay, so I've finished all my patterns. This is the time when I turn on the kettle, and you will see right now I'm doing my really deep scores. So the blade is quite deep in the bread, and I'm getting
really nice cut there, so that is where the bread will rise from, and so I'm putting those cuts in there just to control the rise of the bread, and so when I'm popping them into the oven, I'm putting my bread straight into my preheated oven. I'm filling that little bottom tray up there with pretty much a whole kettle's worth of water, so a lot of steam into my oven when the bread's going in. So popping it into my preheated oven, you want to be careful that the bread won't rise into your element there, or just take into consideration that the rising of the bread. But lots of steam, then I'm letting the steam out to be able to brown the bread. So you can see there, that's the controlled rise I was after. That one's a bit different, it's cut a bit different, and it's risen perfectly, and you can see my patterns there. So I also do for, okay, so here's another one. I'm just lightly doing my score marks, and then you'll see there I'm going to do my deep cut and pop it straight into the oven with some boiling hot water. Yeah, so you want to make sure that you put a nice load of boiling hot water to create that steam, just to help the crust to form up nice and bubbly and crispy. And then just as the bread starts to go golden, I let the steam out so that the crust can firm up. You want a nice, sharp, serrated bread knife. If you try and do it with a chef knife or a soft serrated knife, it will be quite tricky to get through. So you want a nice, sharp serrated knife. Today, this is lunch. We're just having a quick ploughman's lunch, bit of cheese, pickles, honey, and that'll fill our bellies and help us to keep on working.